In Zobeda village, Zamira and Obadele seemed like the perfect couple. They had just welcomed their baby boy, Zanefo, into the world. Life should have been filled with joy. But when doctors said Zanefo had a disability, everything changed. Zamira saw her son as a blessing, a fighter. But Obadele, he saw a burden. Slowly, he started pulling away, his love fading with each passing day. Obadele had always wanted more money, more comfort, more status. Life in Zobeda village felt too small for his dreams. The dusty roads, the simple homes, the daily struggles. He wanted out. He had heard stories of Lagos, the city of bright lights and endless possibilities, where men became rich overnight. He wanted that life, but there was one thing holding him back, or at least, that's how he saw it. His son, Zanefo. Zanefo was born different. He couldn't run like the other children, couldn't play the way boys were expected to. Zamira, his mother, saw nothing but love in his eyes, but Obadele saw limitations. He convinced himself that a man like him wasn't meant to be tied down to a life of struggle. He wanted to be free. And so, one morning, before the village had fully woken up, he made his decision. Without a word, without a second thought, he packed his bags. He didn't look at his sleeping son. He didn't say goodbye to his wife. Instead, he left a single note on the wooden table, the ink still fresh as the sun rose. "I deserve better." Zamira found it just minutes after waking up. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Maybe he had gone to the city for work. Maybe he would return by evening. But as she stepped into their small bedroom and saw the empty space where his clothes once were, the truth hit her like a sharp blade. He wasn't coming back. She sank to the floor, clutching the note in her hands, her heart pounding against her chest. Tears filled her eyes, but she forced them back. She couldn't afford to break down. Not now. Not when she had Zanefo to care for. The village soon found out. Some whispered behind her back, shaking their heads. Others pitied her, offering kind words but little else. "Maybe he will return," some said. "Maybe he just needs time." But deep inside, Zamira knew the truth. Obadele was gone, and he wasn't looking back. Days turned into weeks. There was no letter, no message, no sign that he even cared. She was alone now, a single mother with no financial support, no helping hand, no husband by her side. Yet, as she looked at her son, sleeping peacefully in her arms, she made a silent promise. She would not beg. She would not crumble. She would fight for Zanefo, for their future. And as for Obadele, he may have walked away, believing he deserved better. But one day, he would realize the truth. He had abandoned the greatest treasure he ever had, and by then, it would be too late. The day Obadele left, Zamira felt like the world had collapsed around her. But she had no time to cry. She had a son to feed, a roof to keep over their heads, and a future to build, alone. There was no one coming to save her. If she wanted Zanefo to have a good life, she would have to create it with her own hands. She woke up before the sun each morning and worked until her body ached. She took on whatever jobs she could find, scrubbing floors in wealthier homes, stitching clothes late into the night, and selling fruits at the village market under the burning sun. Some days, she barely made enough to buy food. Other days, she went to bed hungry so Zanefo could eat. The villagers whispered whenever she walked past. "Poor woman," some said with pity. Others were crueler. She should have found another husband by now. But Zamira didn't have time for their words. She had one focus, her son. Zanefo was growing, and though his body was weak, his mind was sharp. He was always curious, always asking questions, always dreaming bigger than the world allowed him to. "Mama, why can't I run like the other children?" he asked one night as he watched them play from the doorway. Zamira knelt beside him, brushing his cheek gently. "Because you were made for something greater," she whispered. She refused to let him see his condition as a curse. He was not weak. He was not less. He was special, and she would do everything in her power to prove it to him. One day, as Zamira sat at the market stall selling oranges, she noticed something strange. People weren't just coming to buy. They were stopping to talk to Zanefo. They asked for his advice, listened to his thoughts, and left the stall looking thoughtful. Word spread through the village about the boy with the bright mind, a boy who couldn't run but could solve problems better than most adults, a boy who saw solutions where others saw obstacles. Soon people stopped looking at Zanefo with pity. They saw him as an inspiration. And Zamira, she saw him as a reminder of why she could never give up. Her struggles had not broken her. They had made her stronger. And one day, the world would know her son's name. Lagos was everything Obadele had dreamed of: loud, alive, and overflowing with opportunity. The city pulsed with energy, its streets buzzing with people who moved fast, talked fast, and lived even faster. This was where fortunes were made, where men rose from nothing and became legends. And Obadele was ready to become one of them. The moment he arrived, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. No more village life, no more waking up to the cries of a child he never wanted, no more struggling with a wife who refused to accept that their son was a burden. Here, in Lagos, he could finally live for himself. His first weeks in the city were tough, but he was determined. He found work at a car dealership, selling luxury vehicles to rich businessmen and politicians. The money was good, far better than anything he could have earned in Zobida village. His first paycheck felt like a victory. He didn't send any of it to Zamira. Instead, he walked into a high-end clothing store and bought himself a designer suit. If he was going to climb the ladder of success, he had to look the part. With money in his pocket and ambition in his heart, Obadele threw himself into the Lagos nightlife. He went to the most expensive clubs, drank the finest whiskey, and surrounded himself with people who, like him, wanted to escape their pasts. He laughed loudly, danced wildly, and for the first time in his life, felt truly alive. But the money he earned never seemed to last. The city was a hungry beast, swallowing cash faster than he could make it. His taste for luxury grew, and soon his salary wasn't enough to keep up with his lifestyle. He started borrowing, promising himself that he would pay it back once he hit it big. Then he met Adesua. She was everything he had ever wanted: beautiful, confident, and most importantly, wealthy. The daughter of a powerful businessman, she carried herself like a queen. She drove the latest cars, wore the finest jewelry, and only drank imported champagne. To Obadele, she wasn't just a woman, she was his golden ticket. He made it his mission to win her over. He showered her with attention, taking her to the best restaurants, buying her flowers, and whispering sweet lies about his bright future. He never spoke about his past. He never mentioned Zamira, and he certainly never spoke of Zenefo. To Adesua, he was an ambitious man on the rise, someone who belonged in her world. She introduced him to influential people, businessmen, politicians, and celebrities. Obadele finally felt like he was part of the elite. He convinced himself that he had made the right choice. He had left behind struggle and embraced success. Meanwhile, back in Zobida village, Zamira was struggling to keep food on the table. She sent messages, asking Obadele if he would send money for their son. She wasn't begging, she simply wanted him to take responsibility. But every message was met with silence. Obadele saw her name pop up on his phone, and for a moment, guilt gnawed at him, but he quickly pushed it away. She'll manage, he told himself. She always does. Weeks turned into months, and Zamira's messages became less frequent. She stopped asking for money. She stopped calling. It was as if she had finally accepted that he was never coming back. Obadele felt a strange sense of relief. It was easier this way. No reminders of his past, no strings pulling him back. He blocked her number, erasing all traces of his old life. To him, Zenefo was just a name that no longer mattered. His life with Adesua was everything he had wanted. Fancy dinners, luxurious vacations, and the admiration of people who believed he was one of them. But behind the expensive suits and charming smiles, cracks were beginning to form. Adesua had expectations. She wanted him to invest in businesses, to prove that he was a man of real wealth, not just a talker. She introduced him to her father, who asked him one simple question: "What do you own?" Obadele had no answer. He owned nothing. He had spent everything he had trying to look successful, instead of actually becoming successful. Doubt crept into Adesua's eyes. She started seeing him for what he really was, a man who had nothing. Then, the worst happened. Adesua left him for someone richer, someone who could actually provide the life she desired. One night, she simply stopped answering his calls. When he showed up at her house, the guards didn't let him in. Just like that, his golden ticket was gone. Without Adesua's influence, the people who once surrounded him disappeared. The businessmen who shook his hand no longer recognized him. His debts piled up, and the loans he had taken to maintain his lifestyle became impossible to pay. The landlord kicked him out of his apartment. The car dealership fired him. He went from dining in five-star restaurants to sleeping on the streets. Lagos, the city that had once welcomed him with open arms, had chewed him up and spat him out. Alone, broke, and humiliated, he thought of Zamira for the first time in years. He thought of Zanepho, the son he had abandoned. He wondered if they were still struggling, if they had managed to survive without him. And then he heard the news. Zamira and Zanepho were no longer poor. Zanepho had won a national innovation contest. A wealthy businessman had taken notice and funded his education. The boy he had abandoned had risen above the life Obadele had run from. Obadele's heart pounded. He couldn't believe it. The son he had once considered a burden was now successful. And Zamira, she was no longer the struggling wife he had left behind. She was strong, independent, and respected. Desperation clawed at him. He had nothing. They had everything. With nowhere else to turn, he made a decision. He would go back. He would return to Zubeda village, hoping, praying, that they would take him in. But what he didn't know was that the family he had abandoned had no space for a man like him anymore, and the door he was about to knock on might never open. Years passed, but Zamira refused to give up. She had no choice. She was a mother, and her son Zanepho depended on her. While others rested, she worked. When the sun rose, she was already in the fields, helping farmers harvest crops for a small wage. When the markets opened, she carried heavy baskets of yams and vegetables, selling them to earn a few coins. At night, she prepared homemade snacks, fried plantains, roasted groundnuts, and spiced meat, selling them outside local gatherings. Life was harsh. There were days when she had nothing but a cup of water to quiet her hunger. There were nights when exhaustion made her body ache, but she could not afford to stop. The villagers gossiped. Some pitied her. Others mocked her. "A woman cannot survive alone," they whispered. She should have remarried. But Zamira didn't want a man to save her. She wanted to save herself. One person stood by her. Abeni, her childhood friend. Unlike the others, Abeni never doubted her. "You have more strength than you realize," she told Zamira. "Let's do something bigger." With Abeni's help, Zamira started a small food business. She began cooking larger meals, jollof rice, spicy stew, fresh bread, selling them at the market and near construction sites where hungry workers gathered. Word spread quickly. Her food was not only delicious, but also affordable. People came from different villages just to buy from her. Her hard work paid off. Slowly, she saved enough money to rent a small stall, and soon, her little business became known as the best food spot in the area. The same villagers who once doubted her now admired her. She had proven them wrong, not with words, but with success. Meanwhile, Zanepho, despite his disability, was growing into a bright young boy. He loved to read, to learn, to dream. He helped his mother where he could, collecting firewood, counting coins, and cheering her on when she felt tired. He never complained about the life they lived. Instead, he focused on the love they shared. While Zamira and Zanepho were rising, Obadele was falling. In Lagos, Obadele had once lived like a king. He had convinced himself that leaving his family was the best decision of his life. He spent his money recklessly, buying expensive clothes, eating at high-end restaurants, and drinking at nightclubs. He met Adesua, a rich and beautiful woman, and thought he had found true happiness. She was everything Zamira wasn't: wealthy, glamorous, and connected. He blocked Zamira's number, erased Zanepho from his thoughts, and focused only on himself. But Lagos is not kind to foolish men. The first sign of trouble was subtle. Adesua started coming home late. She no longer looked at him with admiration, but with boredom. Then, one evening, Obadele walked into his home and found another man sitting comfortably on his couch, drinking his expensive wine. Adesua didn't even flinch. She simply looked at him and said, "You have nothing left to offer me." And just like that, he was thrown out. With nowhere to go, he turned to the so-called friends he had once partied with. The same men who had cheered him on when he spent money now ignored his calls. One by one, they shut their doors. "No money, no friendship," they said. His savings disappeared quickly. Job opportunities were scarce. Employers were not impressed by his flashy past. They wanted hard workers, not men who had wasted their youth chasing pleasure. Debt piled up. His landlord kicked him out. His once fine clothes became dirty and torn. And so, the man who had once walked the streets of Lagos with pride now slept on them. He sat outside the restaurants where he once dined, watching others enjoy meals he could no longer afford. But there was no sympathy for him. No one cared. The world moved on, as if he had never existed. One evening, as he sat by the roadside, a woman walked past carrying a basket of food. She looked familiar, strong, confident. Their eyes met. Zamira. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. She looked different. She was no longer the struggling wife he had abandoned. She was successful, independent, radiant. She saw him. She recognized him, but she did not stop. She did not ask if he was okay. She did not offer him food or shelter. She simply walked past him, just as he had once walked away from her and their son. And in that moment, Obadele understood. This was karma. He had abandoned his family, believing they were his burden. But in the end, he was the one left with nothing. And the cruelest part, Zamira did not need revenge. Her success was enough. For the first time in his life, Obadele felt true regret. But some mistakes cannot be undone, and some doors, once closed, never open again. Zanefo had always been different, not just because of his disability, but because of his mind. While other children ran and played, he sat under the shade of an old baobab tree, sketching ideas in the dirt. He was always thinking, always curious. "Mama, why can't wheelchairs move on sand?" he asked one evening. "Mama, what if there was an easier way for children like me to write without hurting our hands?" Zamira smiled at her son's questions. She saw something special in him. He was not weak. He was not a burden. He was a boy with a gift, a mind that could change the world. As the years passed, Zanefo found ways to learn despite their struggles. He borrowed books from teachers, listened to radio programs, and watched mechanics repair machines in the market. He had no fancy school, no expensive tutors, but his hunger for knowledge was unstoppable. One day, he heard about a national innovation contest. It was open to young minds across the country, students from the best schools, from wealthy families, from places he had only heard about in stories. The challenge, to create something that could improve lives. Zanefo knew exactly what he wanted to build. For weeks he worked tirelessly, using scraps of wood, metal, and rubber he collected from workshops. Zamira watched him with pride and worry. He barely slept, barely ate. "Zanefo, rest," she urged, but he only smiled. "Mama, just a little longer," he whispered. When the day of the contest arrived, Zamira and Abini pooled their savings to buy a bus ticket to the city. It was the first time Zanefo had ever left their village. His heart pounded as he saw the tall building, the flashing lights, the well-dressed children with laptops and fancy gadgets. He felt small, but he reminded himself why he was here. The competition was fierce. One by one, contestants presented their project: solar-powered lamps, water purification systems, digital learning apps. Then, it was Zanefo's turn. He wheeled himself forward, took a deep breath, and began. His invention, a voice-activated writing tool for children with limited hand mobility. Using simple recycled materials and basic technology, he had created a device that allowed disabled children to write just by speaking. It was affordable, easy to use, and life-changing. The room fell silent. Then, applause. The judges were stunned. A boy from a small village, with no resources, had built something that could change education for disabled children across the country. The results came in. Zanefo had won. Tears streamed down Zamira's face as she hugged her son. For the first time, all the pain, the struggle, the sleepless nights, they all made sense. The news spread quickly. Newspapers called Zanefo the boy who defied odds. His story reached powerful ears, including that of Chief Durajaye, a wealthy businessman known for supporting education. He was so moved by Zanefo's story that he invited the boy and his mother to meet him. When they arrived at his grand estate, Chief Durajaye looked at Zanefo with admiration. "You are not just talented, young man. You are a miracle." He turned to Zamira. "And you, madam, are a mother like no other." That day, Chief Durajaye made an announcement that changed their lives forever. He would personally fund Zanefo's education, ensuring he attended the best schools with the best teachers. He would also provide a new home for Zamira and her son, one with electricity, clean water, and comfort they had never known. Zamira could not believe it. Just a few years ago, she was struggling to feed her child. Now, he was being given a future beyond her wildest dreams. As they moved into their new home, Zanefo held his mother's hand. "Mama, we made it," he whispered. She smiled, eyes filled with tears. "No, my son, you made it." But deep in the shadows, someone else had heard the news, Obadele. And for the first time in years, he felt something he had never felt before: regret. Obadele never thought he would see this day. The man who once walked away with pride, chasing dreams of a lavish life, now limped back with nothing but shame. His clothes were tattered, his face hollow, his once strong body now weak from years of struggle. He had lost everything: his job, his wealth, even his so-called friends. The woman he had left Zamira for had betrayed him, taking all his money and throwing him out like trash. Now, with nowhere else to go, he found himself standing at the entrance of Zabida village, a place he had once abandoned without a second thought. As he walked through the familiar dusty paths, heads turned. The villagers whispered, some in shock, others in disgust. "Is that really Obadel?" an old woman muttered. "He looks like a ghost of his former self," another man said. The people who once envied him for leaving now looked at him with pity. His heart pounded as he approached the house he once called home. But it was no longer the small, broken-down hut he had left behind. In its place stood a beautiful, well-built house, painted in fresh colors, with a garden full of flowers. He could hear laughter inside, the sound of a warm, happy home. A home that no longer needed him. His feet felt heavy as he stepped closer. He raised a trembling hand and knocked. The door opened. Zamira stood before him, looking more beautiful than he remembered. She was no longer the struggling, exhausted woman he had abandoned. She held herself with strength, with pride. Behind her stood Xanafo, now a young man, confident, successful, and full of life. The boy he had once seen as a burden was now a symbol of resilience, a name spoken with respect across the village and beyond. Obadele swallowed hard. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Zamira, Xanafo, I'm sorry." Silence. Zamira's eyes held no anger, no hatred, just an unreadable calm. "Sorry?" she finally said, her voice steady. "You left us with nothing. You never looked back. And now, after all these years, you come knocking." Obadele's lips trembled. "I was a fool. I thought I was chasing a better life. But life has taught me a lesson. I lost everything, Zamira. I have nowhere to go." He dropped to his knees. "Please, forgive me." Xanafo stepped forward. He had spent years wondering about the man who had left him, questioning why he wasn't good enough for his own father. Now, seeing Obadele like this, a broken man, weak and desperate, he felt no satisfaction, no joy in his suffering. "You didn't want me," Xanafo said quietly. "You said I was a burden. Now that you are the one in need, you come back?" Tears streamed down Obadele's face. "I was blind, my son. I didn't see your worth. I was selfish. Please, let me make things right." Zamira sighed. The weight of the past was heavy, but she had long since moved forward. She had built a new life, one where pain and betrayal no longer controlled her. Looking at Obadele now, she saw a man who had already been punished, not by her, but by life itself. "You will never get back what you lost," she said softly, "but that is your burden to carry, not ours." Obadele bowed his head in shame. He had hoped for forgiveness, but he knew deep down that he did not deserve it. As he turned to leave, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Xanafo. "Go to the village shelter," he said. "You will find food and a place to rest, but what happens next is up to you." Obadele nodded, unable to stop the tears from falling. He had once abandoned his family, believing they were holding him back. Now he realized they were the ones who had moved forward while he had been left behind. As he walked away, the villagers watched. Some shook their heads, others murmured in surprise. But Zamira and Xanafo stood at their door, watching in silence. Forgiveness was not always about letting someone back in. Sometimes it was about letting go and moving forward, and that was exactly what they had done. Obadele stood at the doorstep, his once proud shoulders now slumped, his eyes filled with regret. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsed his words, prayed for a miracle. But now, as he faced the family he had abandoned, he felt like a stranger in his own story. Zamira stood before him, silent, her face unreadable. She had once cried oceans over him, begged the heavens for answers, but time had changed her. The woman who had been left broken was now whole, strong, successful, and free of the pain he had caused. She didn't tremble, she didn't weep, she only watched. Xanafo stood beside her, tall and proud, no longer the helpless child Obadele had walked away from. His eyes, so much like his mother's, held no warmth, no anger, just a quiet strength that made Obadele's chest tighten with shame. "I'm sorry," Obadele whispered. His voice cracked, heavy with the weight of years lost. "I was foolish. I made the worst mistake of my life. Please, forgive me." Zamira folded her arms. There was no rage in her expression, no desire for revenge, just silence. A silence so cold it made Obadele's skin prickle. He had expected her to scream, to cry, to at least ask why, but she did none of those things. Xanafo stepped forward. His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of a scar too deep to heal. "You left me when I needed you the most," he said. "Now, I don't need you at all." Obadel felt his knees weaken. Those words cut deeper than any insult, any slap, any punishment the world could give him. He had lost jobs, lost money, lost friends, but nothing compared to this. "I was young," he pleaded. "I was scared. I thought I was chasing a better life." "A better life," Zamira finally spoke, her voice sharp, like ice breaking. "You thought a life without us was better, while I worked day and night just to keep our son alive, while he grew up wondering why his father never came back." Obadel dropped his gaze. He had told himself so many lies over the years, convinced himself that they were better off without him, that they would move on. But standing here, he saw the truth. They had moved on. They had survived without him. "Please," he whispered, reaching out as if to touch the past, to hold on to something that was already gone. "Give me a chance to make things right." Zamira shook her head. "You lost that chance the day you walked away." Obadel's breath came in short gasps. He wanted to cry, but no tears came. He wanted to beg, but no words felt enough. He had thought losing money was the worst pain in the world, but this was far worse. "Zanefo!" He turned to his son, searching for even the smallest crack in his resolve. "I am still your father." Zanefo tilted his head, as if considering the words. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was one of quiet acceptance. "You are my father," he said. "But a father isn't just a man who gives life. A father is a man who stays." Obadel felt the final piece of his heart shatter. He had left them behind, believing they were his burden, but in truth, they had been his greatest treasure, and now he had nothing. Zamira took a deep breath. "We don't hate you, Obadele. We don't wish you harm, but we don't need you. We built a life without you, and we will continue to live it without you." Obadel wanted to scream, to fall to his knees, to undo time, but time was merciless. It never gave second chances. Zanefo stepped back, his gaze unwavering. "Goodbye, Obadel." The door closed. Obadele stood there, staring at the wooden door, hoping, praying it would open again. But it didn't, and in that moment, he finally understood. The money, the women, the parties, none of it had mattered. His real wealth had been here all along, and he had thrown it away. He had walked away once, thinking he deserved better. Now, he walked away again, knowing he had lost the best. Obadel stood outside the house, his body weak from hunger, his soul drowning in regret. He had once been a man full of pride, a man who thought he deserved better. Now, he was nothing more than a shadow of his past, a broken figure standing at the doorstep of the family he had abandoned. Zamira opened the door once more, but this time, there was no anger, no resentment in her eyes, just a quiet finality. She held a plate of food in her hands and extended it toward him. "Eat," she said simply. Obadel hesitated, shame burning his skin. He didn't deserve her kindness. He had expected rejection, expected hatred, but here she was, offering him a meal, even after everything he had done. Slowly, he reached for the plate, his hands trembling. Zamira watched him as he ate, but her face remained unreadable. When he finished, he looked up, desperate for a sign that she would give him another chance. "Zamira," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. She held up her hand, stopping him. "This is not forgiveness, Obadele. This is mercy. But mercy does not mean you are welcome back." Obadele felt the weight of those words sink into his chest like stones. He had lost them, truly lost them. He had spent years convincing himself that one day he could return, that one day they would take him back. But that day would never come. Zanefo stood beside his mother, his presence strong, unshaken. He no longer needed a father. He had never needed one after Obadele left. Zamira had been enough, and now they stood together, not as victims of abandonment, but as survivors. Obadele swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to ask for another chance, to plead, to prove he could change. But what could he offer? He had nothing left, no wealth, no status, no power. "You made your choice long ago," Zamira said, her voice steady. "Now, you must live with it." Obadele lowered his gaze, realizing that this was justice, not the kind that came with anger or revenge, but the kind that was far worse, being forgotten, being left behind. He slowly turned away, his steps heavy, his heart heavier. Each step he took was a reminder of what he had lost, of what could never be undone. The laughter of the village children echoed in the distance, the sound of life moving on, leaving him behind. As he walked away, He stole one last glance over his shoulder. Zamira and Xanafo stood together, unshaken, unbroken, a symbol of true strength, of resilience, of love that had survived the worst storms. And just like that, Obadel disappeared into the very shadows he had chosen. The door closed behind him, not in anger, not in hatred, but in finality, because some mistakes could never be undone, and some people never got a second chance.